Eros is itself always directed towards a desired object. It is always then ecstatic. Socrates recounts his conversation with Diotima as a way of reinforcing this conclusion. For Diotima, as for Socrates, there is no pure Eros. Eros is always of something. Eros is not a god, but is rather a diamond. All of the gods, says Diotima, are both beautiful and happy, but Eros is neither. For what is beautiful and happy neither desires beauty nor happiness, because it is already satiated. Is Eros then ugly or bad, asks Socrates. Hush, don't blaspheme, retorts the priestess. The choice is not between two opposites, either beautiful and good or ugly and bad. Are you not aware, says Diotima, that there is something in between? The introduction of the metaxy symbol, the realm of the middle, the intermediate or the in-between, is of crucial importance to understanding the role of the philosopher in his or her investigation of reality. This is why Diotima immediately draws Socrates' attention to an epistemic point, namely that there is something between ignorance and wisdom. And this something is, she calls, right opinion, doxa. But right opinion, or doxa, for Diotima is not a hunch or a mere blick. Right opinion, in the symposium at least, is the form of knowledge proper to the kind of creatures that we are, the kind of creatures that dwell in the tensive middle, suspended between transcendence and immanence. Our knowledge in the middle is philosophical, the loving pursuit of wisdom, or Sophia. We don't have her, we pursue her. To know in the middle realm is to engage in an act of relational transformation, to participate via one's love in the ontological reality of that which one knows. This differentiates the human and daimonic approach from the approaches of to knowing, from the epistemic approaches of either the gods on the one hand or the vulgar on the other. Diotima explains, no god loves wisdom or desires to become wise, for he is so. On the other hand, neither do the ignorant desire wisdom, or love it, nor desire to become wise. For ignorance is difficult just in this, that though not beautiful, nor good, nor wise, yet it seems to itself to be sufficient. The pursuit of wisdom, and that seeming to itself to be sufficient, that's the description of the self-mediating anthropic middle I was describing the previous terms of praxis falling into before. The pursuit of wisdom requires us to acknowledge both our constitutive lack. We are all, says Diotima, children of Pania, of poverty, and our adorative trajectory, for poros, wealth, fortune, is our father. This philosophical mode of knowledge is both cognitive and erotic, because we cannot know comprehensively. Our knowledge is always constituted by the supplement it receives from our desire. In this way, desire teaches us to speculate beyond the strictures of a monological gauge. It orients our vision adoratively according to the trajectory of the good in which our vision participates, and thus participatory desire allows us to make necessarily speculative but metaphysically robust conjectures. Your desire is already immersed in something, and in that way it's telling you about that something. And that desire that's being told to you, that hasn't been cognized yet, is supplementing what you're capable of knowing with certainty. This is how speculation comes into being, not as an exploration of my whims, but as a way of feeling into the world. Once our desire is engaged in the event of knowing, then we must necessarily speak of knowing as a kind of action, and we rightly look for the practices with which it is associated. Note, however, that this Platonic and metaxic turn to practice is entirely different in character from the liberal and post-liberal turns discussed above. For what Plato and Diotima describe is not in any way the reduction of knowledge to its performance, as must always be the case when the heavens are closed, but rather the way that a certain deployment of desire opens new possibilities of vision. There are no reified limits here, no epistemically or ontologically buffered selves. The Platonic philosopher dwells in the middle, but always reaches for that which is beyond, and so always extends the bounds of her vision. Eros is, as Plato makes clear, the archetype of the philosopher, for philosophical desire is infinite, unbounded, therefore, even by its own identity. We do not even yet begin to know what a This may explain the puzzling aspect of the famous parable from Plato's later dialogue, the Sophist. The Eleatic stranger is talking to Theaetetus, and he explains to him that there's a war raging between the gods and the giants about the nature of essence. In other words, it's a war over knowledge. How are we to understand the nature of things? The stranger explains. Some of them are dragging down all things from heaven and from the unseen to earth, and they literally grasp in their hands rocks and oaks. Of these they lay hold and obstinately maintain that the things only which can be touched or handled have being and essence. Because they define being and a body as one, and if anyone else says that what is not a body exists, they altogether despise it, and they'll hear of nothing but body. I have often met with such men, and terrible fellows they are. And that is the reason why their opponents cautiously defend themselves from above, out of an unseen world, mightily contending that true essence consists of certain intelligible and incorporeal ideas, the bodies of the materialists which by them are maintained to be the very truth. They break up into little bits by their arguments, and they affirm them to be not essence, but generation and motion. Between the two armies, Theaetetus, there is always an endless conflict raging concerning these matters. As one might expect, though, Plato is unconvinced by either of these extremes, whether they appear in the titanic guise of sophism or the divine costume of the Eleatics. Like the Ouroboros that swallows its tail, pure immanence and pure transcendence, he insists, collude in the evacuation of meaning, depth, and density. Plato discerns that both of these parties, in the frenzy of their battle, leave behind nothing but a scorched earth, rid of motion, life, soul, mind, and being. And in this way, Plato is, of course, defending the properly philosophical realm, which is the realm of the metaxy, suspended between transcendence and immanence. All of that is readily apparent, but the interesting, the puzzling aspect of the parable occurs when the stranger concludes. Then the philosopher, who has the truest reverence for these qualities, cannot possibly accept the notion of those who say that the whole is at rest, either as unity or in many forms. And he will be utterly deaf to those who assert universal motion. As children say entreatingly, give us both, so the philosopher will include both the movable and the immovable in his definition of being and of the all. The question that I always wrestled with when I read this text is, where did these children come from? Is Plato just making a joke about childish petulance, kids who want everything but can't have it? Or is it not rather the case that only the one who becomes like a child and dares to demand, is it not rather the case that only the one who becomes like a child dares to demand give us both? The child is subject neither to the chaotic flux of pure becoming, nor to the stasis of formal eternity. Instead, the child grows and develops, which is to say, the child participates in a kind of vectoral becoming, a transformation that preserves what once was and moves towards a good that may yet be. The child is able to demand, give us both, because the child, like Eros, the child of Poros and Pania, is already both in her very self. If, as I argued above, the inadequacies of the liberal and the post-liberal turns to practice may be traced to a reification and isolation of the self, then what we require is a turn to practice that restores the conception of the self as porous and capable of non-invidious adventures of becoming. However, this cannot be the purely immanent porosity of Deleuze, of Foucault, of the giants of the Eleatic stranger, for pure immanence also evacuates real becoming, leaving us with a self bizarrely buffered precisely by the extremity of its porosity. You dissolve all my boundaries so much, and I'm just as buffered in a certain sense as if you make an absolute wall around me. Because in either case, nothing can affect, transform, wound, or grow me. If then we seek an account of practice that can do justice to the coincidence of spiritual transformation and cognitive illumination that we find in the contemplative traditions, then we need an account of the self as subsistent but internally related to that which precedes, encompasses, and transcends it. To summarize and to conclude, the essence of the problem we have been discussing is this: do practices establish formative contact with the external world, with God, spirit, or the sacred? Or are practices merely ways of constituting our own worlds of self-mediation? So long as the self remains absolutely buffered, sustained spiritual practice can only yield projective dissimulation or communicative isolation. But if the self is already internally related to that which precedes it and is erotically ordered to that which exceeds it, then we can imagine practice not as a mode of dissimulation, but rather as a mode of conversion, metanoia, and conformation. Practices need not solidify the self's boundaries, but may instead transform the self and open it to new, subtler levels of relationship. This metanoetic transformation of the self needn't be read in a non-realist or skeptically constructivist manner. Instead of the quasi-Kantian model, whereby the subject projects its scheme into an unknown world and upon an ineffable divine, we should rather understand practices in a transformative. We should rather understand transformative practices advance in an almost Whiteheadian manner, as the way the world projects itself and its articulations into the subject. So it's not we projecting upon the world, but the world projects itself and its articulations into the subject. And indeed, practices may be the way in which God lures the subject in its becoming towards the good, a good that the Western contemplative tradition has always said never ends, because it's a good that is ultimately deifying. Practices are the operative means through which we negotiate our relationships within a world in which we ourselves are also immersed. Practices are the operative means in which we negotiate our relationships between ourselves and a world in which we are already immersed. Successful practices pick out aspects of the world with which to engage, and the regular participation in such practices conforms the participant through habit and discipline to these select contours. Successful practices thus bring us into relation to a greater or lesser degree with what exists beyond the illusory boundaries of the buffered self's supposedly private and guarded world. This is precisely why the epistemic boundaries involved in the modern and postmodern, or liberal and post-liberal turns to practice are finally unwarranted. We are essentially and genetically related to the world, and I would even say essentially ordered towards God, before we can ever project upon either the world or the divine. And one of the most powerful forms of this relation is the holistic habituation of sustained practice. We may indeed subsequently order our cognition of the world according to our practices, but because these practices are already themselves constrained and ordered by the world with which they must deal, we might speak just as accurately of the world itself ordering its own appearance to our cognition via our practices. Practices are the ways the world makes us capable of perceiving its various faces. The same must be said for holistic practices of contemplation, adoration, and prayer that thematize our relationship with God, the sacred, and the spiritual. On this account, there is no possibility of accommodating a given communal practice while neglecting the divinity or the enchantment, that gives both the community and the practice to be. The practice is not an epistemic intermediary between the participant and the divine, but rather the presence, the action, and the knowledge of the divine itself, shaping and holistically transforming the participant's life. All of which is only to say what the contemplative tradition, in the West at least, and arguably far beyond as well, has always held. We are creatures whose end is the vision of God, and whose life is an adventure of formation. Thanks.
first of all, wow. You just, I mean, I've been blown away by you before. I've been studying with you for almost an entire year now, 2 semesters. But whoa, and yes, and I'll ask you about all of that a number of times, hopefully in the near future. Why, you often use the feminine pronoun, which is great, in reference to the individual. Why use the masculine pronoun God? I would challenge you in your reading to supplement goddess, because you're often using the feminine pronoun to refer to the human,
Right.
but why use the masculine pronoun to refer to the transcendent, the divine?
I don't think God's a pronoun, so.
Okay.
That's and I don't use masculine pronouns for God.
Okay.
Using, in a sense, my own sort of stylistic judgment on that. Goddess is fine, but if I use goddess, it tends to, I think, accentuate the sense that I want to avoid of. When I use God, I use it as a sign for ultimacy, and for a number of culturally related reasons, I find that when I use goddess, it tends to raise associations that would lead to thinking, well, there's a God to coincide with it, or to involve aspects of gender.
So you feel like God is less gendered than goddess in that sense. You could almost say that.
Well, I mean, historically, God is gendered, but goddess is even more gendered, right? And so it's a problem.
Only in relationship to God, but okay.
Well, I mean, it's a problem, but it's one that I try to avoid by mixing my actual pronouns rather than the
So a capital he or a capital she instance instead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to capitalize them either, but yes, I would mix my pronouns for that reason.
Okay, just wondering.
My question is also about your conception of God.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in this philosophical return to the sacred, if I can put it that way.
Sure.
Are we returning to the same God, or is it? So what has to change? Has to have changed? And in my mind, this is paralleling the question in physics, where we're becoming aware of the effect of the observer. So these absolutes that physics had, space and time, are literally bending in the presence of the observer, and we're having to take that into account. I'm seeing the same thing would have to happen to God, so that the conception of God or the ultimacy would be a little bit more problematic of the one that we wanted to believe in.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I say no so quickly is because I don't think there's one direction of return, and that's to the extent that I like your notion of a recovery of the sacred, and there is a recovery of the sacred happening in philosophy. I did the analytic stuff, but we could have spent a lot of time doing almost the same thing in continental philosophy during the last 34 years, extraordinarily. What we have happening, though, is not a return to a single tradition. Instead, what basically happens after if the modern critique seems to scour the surfaces of the sacred, that proves unsustainable, and then it's almost as if it explodes upon itself in like a firework blast rather than a torchlight or a flashlight, right? It's not a single direction of return, as if we were just recuperating the tradition that held, even though the tradition wasn't monolithic previously. But instead, you find yourself in a kind of radical pluralization. And so to that extent, I wouldn't want to say we're returning to any one sacred, because actually we're returning to a vast multiplicity of sacreds. Right. Nevertheless, I also want to use, when I talk about ultimacy, I'm not happy speaking about ultimacy as multiple, because I think the notion of ultimacy includes a sense of being beyond multiplicity.
Right. Would that ultimacy at least be slightly contradictory in order to subsume the multiplicity?
Well, I mean, in relation to some of what, to certain aspects of what I was saying, I think it would depend on what kind of an epistemic approach you're taking. So contradiction, it doesn't seem to me, is a univocal concept. So sometimes things are contradictory in one way, and then they're not contradictory in another way. And sometimes things appear things can be disclosed as contradictory depending on the kind of questions we ask and the kind of questioner who asks it. So, I mean, you and I read Nicholas of Cusa together, and Nicholas thinks that if we're to speak of God, we can speak of a God who isn't just the coincidence of opposites, but is beyond the coincidence of opposites. And so there's clearly a kind of extraordinarily chaotic, cognitive, contradictory moment that happens there. But I don't think the contradiction is felt at every step along the way. It's not felt at every step of the journey leading up to that point. The contradiction is almost achieved, and then the contradiction is let go of. The contradiction.
But after that, we don't regress back into a simpler truth. It seems like a truth that is problematic from this side would be reached on the other side of the contradiction. So I'm not even suggesting that we end in contradiction, but at least that what comes after the contradiction is not nearly as simple as we think it is to resolve contradiction on this side.
Yeah, and I think the account of knowledge, I mean, the only place where I want to be careful not to agree too quickly is, on the one hand, the account of knowledge that I was trying to sketch, or at least point to here, is an account that makes contradiction much more present in the world,
Right.
because knowledge is elicited by means of approach. It's not a kind of common currency like tiles on the Scrabble board. So once that happens, then the contradiction is intensely multiplied. On the other hand, I guess where I'm somewhat resistant is I think that many people who thought about these things for a long time before modernity also knew about that contradiction being extraordinarily multiplied that way.
Right.
And the sense that they spoke with easy propositions or something like that is, I think, maybe more a hangover of certain cultural and stylistic procedures than one of a detailed thesis about the world.
Thank you for that, Jay. I look forward to being able to read the text again, challenge the ideas again by reading it, and also in context that I imagine. I heard you say chapter when you were reading it first, so I imagine it's a chapter of your book. Okay.
One part of it.
I can't wait to read the whole book. You know how sympathetic I am to what I take to be your project here. And I'm wondering if I can draw you out a little bit in a direction that I found myself going in that I think is implicit in what you did, but that you didn't do. I'll try not to take too long to reconstruct this so that you can respond. I noticed that in your account of the genealogy of the problematic that you're tracing and the kinds of solutions that you're pointing to, you, in a sense, end with Kant. I mean, in terms of the traditional philosophical trajectory, you end with Kant.
Yeah.
When you take it up again with Husserl and Frege,
Yeah.
right? Brief mention of the British absolute idealists as the sort of foil or the catalyst that started the post-traditional philosophical thing that it takes. So it sort of ends with Kant and with the various aporia that Kant sort of leaves us with. And then you trace his development on the two tracks and so on. And then you go back to the beginning, Plato. And I think it's beautiful, it's coherent, and I agree with them in the spirit that we're doing. And I'm wondering, what I found myself doing, you could probably guess, is,
Pretty sure it's really,
right? I mean, the big elephant in the room, of course, is Hegel. who...
Oh, Hegel.
Yeah. Even in the introduction to the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So Hegel, the first one, the one to found the philosophy of religion.
Yes, well, not.
He wrote the first philosophy of religion.
Ralph
Systematic.
Systematic.
And as you know, for Hegel, philosophy is a history of philosophy.
Yeah,
So again, you are giving a history here,
yeah,
recounting. You are presenting a problem and enacting a resolution of it by giving a genealogy of history of it. And as you know, this was Hegel's heads, and the only way you can do philosophy in a sense is to do history of philosophy and show how what we are doing is the coherent expression of what leads to what we're doing in a sense. So, and then I'm skip to the end of your presentation where you're talking about both the middle, which is mediation. Of course, for Hegel, mediation is a central concept. But he actually proposes going from immediacy through mediation to intra-mediation.
Right.
What the intra-mediation is of course Geist, the absolute, the whole, which is the process of its own development. Okay? And at the end you say, might it not be the world that is enacting its own intelligibility through our practices as we come to know it. So, which to me sounds a lot like the intra-mediation of the absolute, the Geist. Right?
yes.
So in other words, I can see a whole Hegelian alternative. So instead of going all the way back to Plato, going to the beginning, go to the end of that process where the love of wisdom became wisdom itself.
Yes.
So
That, I have sort of two responses to that. One, I did try to gesture towards Hegel. At one point, I had to throw away huzzah for the German idealists who were the first to notice that.
I noticed that.
But I don't go to Hegel in this or in this project usually for two reasons. The first is strategic, in that the development of the trajectories I'm tracing they're not open to going to Hegel either.
Right.
And so I find an opening for recuperations of this sort, but I find tin ears when I bring up Hegel about this stuff. I think there's really cool stuff going on with Hegel elsewhere, but it's not actually like a lot of the people who are retrieving Hegel in these more broad conversations are doing something very different than using it in a way that I can't figure out how to make that how that answers or helps me with the problems I'm concerned with here. So in that sense, it's just like a kind of purely strategic thing.
Even though like Charles Taylor, William Desmond, the people you're quoting are both
Hegelians. Well, yes, but Desmond is he's like an anti-Hegelian in many ways, and Taylor does, and I'm not against either of them, nor am I against the retrieval of Hegel in the sense. It's just I don't know how to bring it into. I myself don't know how to mediate the conversations that I find myself in with Hegel. Right? I just strategically am not able to do it. I think someone else might
Well,
be able
I'd love to talk with you and others about it. I won't write about it, but anyway.
And then the other reason though is I get skittish around Hegel for precisely the way you ended. Is I don't believe that wisdom exhausted itself and became Sophia in Hegel. And so when I talk about, I actually am very happy preserving a distinction, in which I do. I talk about, in a sense, I want a self in which the world is projecting itself into the self, and a self in which the divine that is not just the world is projecting itself into the self. So I parallel both of those. So I want a fuller sense of a self who's completely a self as part of this world, and it's a world and self that's open to these divine projections that haven't wrapped themselves up and history hasn't come to a proposing it. So for those reasons, I find myself less attracted to Hegel because I'm troubled by the sense that
The word is heavy.
well, I'm troubled by claims to have become wisdom rather than to be pursuing wisdom, and it loses what I want here, which is that sense of. I mean, so much of what I was trying to get at the end is that sense of the dynamic, vectoral, historicized transformation that doesn't end, in a sense, that constantly leads us on. You know, it's the divine feminine leads us ever further.
I will end by saying,
Chief.
please remember that to interpret either me or my reading of Hegel or my reading as having imagined that everything is ended is a profound misunderstanding of what meaning Hegel. That I'll
Right.
just keep at that. So we need to
that's
talk.
good. That's good. That's yeah. I normally don't talk much about Hegel because
It's hard to talk about coherently.
well, because anytime I find myself in Hegel, I can't find my way around very much because I find that wherever I would try to get a hold of it or try to articulate something, it's like he's always thought of it ahead of me and it's out there in front of me, and yet I'm still left a little, with a little bit of Kierkegaard's concerns.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I want to go back to the sort of dual trajectories between the analytic and continental tradition that you started off with. And where we ended up there was you sort of suggested that both of those traditions had sort of exhausted themselves and that we're in a sort of eccentric or kind of repetitious, decadent phase of those traditions. And that you're seeing this return to the religious or the return to practice, the return to capital P philosophy as a real alternative that's emerging that's not neatly either tradition. So we should start thinking about how do we think about these emerging traditions without collapsing them into the familiar historical categories that we're now used to.
Yeah, that's better said than I did.
What I want to ask you about is that at the same time, I'm mindful and tracking of another tradition that's emerging right now that also doesn't fit neatly into either continental or analytic traditions, and it's a sort of extremely incisive, almost aggressive naturalism,
Right.
atheism and nihilism,
Right.
Sort of celebratorily so.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in, you mentioned Mesu, but Badiou is doing it before him, and we have this emergence of like Wilfrid Sellars and continental philosophy, which Sellars probably already a mixed figure in his own work, but he's being imported, this American philosopher, into
Right.
contemporary continental philosophy for explicitly atheistic, naturalistic
Yeah.
purposes, so as to maybe build tools to kind of fight the move you're making here.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
there's kind of new battle lines are emerging, and so I want to know what you think about the simultaneous emergence of this other tradition alongside of what you're talking about,
Yeah.
and what do we think of these two traditions? If they're not analytic and continental, without
Right.
saying, well, it's this and this, but
Yeah.
how do you approach them?
Well, I don't think we have names for them yet. I think that's exactly how I read the situation too, in terms of these developments. I think that's really exciting because
Right.
I'm excited about being around to witness the birth of sort of really genuinely new philosophical projects. And I think those two are locked in a kind of polemic with each other. I think it's a really generative polemic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't want to, polarize them in that way, but to call attention to that they're very different traditions,
they are
very different values.
They are, yeah. It's in a sense they're finding themselves in the same problems, and it seems like there's almost two different routes that make sense
Yeah.
to pursue how to respond to those problems. And it could be that 30 years down the line will have worked out better that one or the other, or both of them run into their own collapsing of themselves. But right now it's exciting because both of those seem like really vigorous, viable ways to do that. They haven't fully articulated themselves, so there's a lot of crossover and a lot of a lot of sort of Janus-based figures who seem to belong to both, even though one is so strongly in one and the other. And I find that exciting. I mean, to me, one of the biggest sort of takeaways, just as a philosophy, as a reader and practitioner of philosophy that I take from this studying this history and so forth, is it's made me, it's freed me from feeling confined by certain narrow streams within which one would have to operate. I find that there's a whole lot of tradition bending that happens. And once you escape from being defined by the problematics of a given historical tradition, then you can find a lot of people addressing your questions not directly but diagonally all the time. It's really generative. But I don't know, in one sense, in sort of like Kuhnian language, we're not quite in an ordinary science time in, I think, either analytic or continental philosophy. And it's not clear exactly how the sort of contours of those research projects will eventually develop. Yeah, do you have more to say about that?
No, I just wanted to raise that because it seems like
Yeah.
if what you're gesturing to is sort of obviating this traditional divide, there's this whole other movement that's also obviating this traditional divide.
Yeah.
Both of which I think are very interesting.
And both of us have our eyes on each other and are thinking, I have to watch out for that one.
Right. Well, we're sort of in the academy phase, like you were saying, where like these cadets like train together, but now they're going out
Yeah.
into the world and
Yeah.
military metaphors are maybe not great, but in a sense, that's what these two sides are wanting to do.
You've talked about self-implicating, or self-implication was a theme that has been kind of carried here. And you've talked about, my phrase for it is practices that are generative of philosophical insight. But in your presentation, I didn't get a sense that you were really practicing what you were advocating. I hadn't seen you talk about the practices that you've done to generate the insight you've come to. You referred to the same kind of methods that we philosophers use of reading and writing, kind of talking in this kind of manner. But I know that there's much more at stake here, and I know you have more going on than that. So a question that I want to ask you, I don't want to put you on the spot because I realize that there's a lot of arguments we need to make preliminarily in order to get us to a position where we can truly self-implicate. So I'm not trying to, again, to put you on the spot, but I want to ask, at what point do we start to make explicit our practices?
Right.
You talked about, at the very end, you said a successful practice, and then I was really curious to hear how you were going to finish that sentence. And what you said was that successful practices will identify particular contours of reality, and then trace those or follow those and kind of cultivate enrichment along that. But I'd like to know more about criteria of successful praxis. And I think that that's important for continuing philosophy in the way that you're proposing. I mean,
Totally. That's a good question.
In traditional contexts, we have lineage, right? But I sense that lineage has a changed sense in the new context that you're elaborating here. It's a little bit more, it's pluralistic, it's more wide open. So I wonder if you could respond a little to what you just said.
Well, in one sense, I mean, I didn't define practice in here, and I'm aware of that being a problem. And I also didn't also, I mean, as Sean pointed out, this is part of a much larger project. And in that larger project, I spent a lot of time dwelling on particular accounts of those things. This is kind of my takeaway for how philosophy is done now. So I chose not to do something on some of the figures that I've learned how to integrate philosophy and spiritual practice from, where you get more about the actual practices themselves. But the two things I guess I'd want to say about practice is, on the one hand, I think a practice is deeply communally bound. So practice, because I think of myself as deeply ontologically communally bound, like I'm a social communal creature, and that is a deeply important aspect of what it means to be, I think, a human being or a being. And so the practices, in one sense, are things that communities do, and not just something an individual happens to come up with. I almost think you could have a version of the private language argument that says it can't actually be a private practice. On the other hand, successful practices are those that are not. Successful practices are those that, one, a community can find a way to validate and that they can sustain. So a practice can be successful at one moment and not at another. And that happens all the time. We find ourselves in communal situations with things that work for us. Practices are habituated means of doing something, usually with some sort of intent. But often, sometimes we have unconscious practices that still, whether they got in there by history, reception, or by instinct or whatever, find their way into us. But practices that were working at one time, that habitually produced the skills and relationships that made it desirable to continue that practice, and to continue that practice. They can reach moments of breakdown. In a certain sense, I think the habits and practices that sustain analytic and continental philosophy were once deeply successful and are now reaching a point of breakdown. And that point of breakdown can be either communal dissatisfaction, it can be a kind of loss of the erotic lure that pulls one to it, it can be a whole set of other things. I mean, it could be causing immense or even somewhat trivial political and social injustices or things like that, right? So there are all sorts of ways that we have to police that, or at least judge that, discriminate. But identifying what those would be would also be tied to identifying what one is, like what are the reasons that one is coming to this practice now. And so in all of this, that's a self-abdicating endeavor too, right? To say if what I'm after is, for example, contemplative insight, then I'm going to have a certain set of criteria that my community will be helping me to use to validate that. And that's where I think it would be different from the old lineages.
Right.
I think that I want to put it in a kind of more Wittgensteinian communal sense of where the validation comes from, even kind of Freudian or whatever kind of like democratic sense, that the community as a whole, the community out of which I find myself being born anew every time, is in some sense making these decisions. So it's constant. Successful practices are constantly renegotiated.
I'm reminded of Ecclesiastes, the ancient understanding of church as a communal endeavor of an understanding of the divine. And I think about Camus' quote, "We kill God to build the church," which is simply to say that the old way, the old reason, the old talk.
Right.
Since we know you're a magician now, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the middle as a vanishing medium.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, what I meant by that is, this. I don't want to knock Hegel.
I wish you were.
Camera's still around.
That's true.
And I actually don't. I think Hegel's more complex than this. But that sense of being self-mediating, that the mediation would be entirely enclosed, seems to me that
It's okay.
it seems to me that that's the same situation that I was using Plato to open up about, right, the ones who insist on absolute transcendence or absolute immanence. They're like the Ouroboros that eats its own tail. The mediator as self-mediating, if all I'm mediating is mediating myself, and mediation is supposed to be, in one sense, how I come into existence, it's kind of like eating your own head, which is hard, but if successful, you disappear. And I mean, I think finally, everyone who claims to be self-mediating is not. I mean, that would be sort of like my transcendental argument against it, is people claim that they have self-mediating things and think because of that they don't have to appeal to either immanence or transcendence. But I've never found anyone who's really been able to sustain that claim. It seems to me there's always a speculative supplement wagering both on that which is pre-theoretical and pre-linguistic that we received, and that which is speculative, adorative, or erotic that we are oriented towards and to which we strain ecstatically. And it seems to me that that's what sustains mediation, and I want that. Like, I'd be really upset if someone actually could stop that, because everything I care about is in the realm of mediation. I don't want relationships that have or a self-mediating relationship. There's another word for that, and it's not as enjoyable as mediating.
We've reached 8:30, so we should probably wrap up and
Great.
continue questions after we officially break. But Jake, thank you so much.
Yeah.